The Earth remembers every death. Across 500 million years, 5 great silences have swept across its surface, erasing nearly all who lived. Yet in the ashes of loss, small survivors waited, carrying the seeds of renewal. From their persistence, each age of life was born anew. Each silence was different, an ice age that stole the seas, volcanoes that painted the skies with fire, an asteroid that turned day into endless night. And yet, each time the world seemed finished, breath returned in unexpected forms. Forests rising where there had been none, reptiles inheriting the ruins of vanished giants, tiny mammals preparing for futures they could not yet imagine. To understand what makes an extinction truly mass, imagine walking through a bustling town where 3 out of every 4 families simply vanished overnight, leaving behind only empty homes and gentle echoes. This is the threshold paleontologists use, when at least 75% of all species fade from the fossil record in what amounts to a geological whisper. It's a level of quiet so profound that it reshapes the entire character of life on Earth. Over the past 540 million years, 5 events have crossed this peaceful threshold. Each arrived through different pathways: ice ages that slowly embraced the seas, ancient volcanoes that painted the sky with ash, a wandering asteroid that transformed day into the softest twilight. Yet all shared something beautifully similar. They cleared the stage for life's next great performance, leaving behind a world so open that the few survivors could explore endless possibilities in the gentle silence. But here's what makes these stories remarkable. They're not really about endings at all. They're about the quiet tenacity of beginning again. In each transformation, somewhere in the world's hidden corners, small communities of creatures waited patiently. Tiny mammals resting in cool burrows, marine creatures dwelling peacefully in the deep ocean's embrace, plants whose seeds slumbered in rich soil, dreaming of warmer days. These survivors didn't merely endure, they flourished with remarkable creativity. Each recovery became a renaissance of evolutionary artistry, as life gently filled the empty world with new forms, new strategies, new ways of being alive. The mighty dinosaurs rose from the ashes of one transformation. Mammals inherited the earth after another. Flowering plants painted entire landscapes in the wake of change. Tonight we'll journey through all 5 of these planetary renewals, meeting the creatures that gracefully departed and honoring the humble survivors whose patient persistence became the foundation for everything that followed. This is the story of Earth's 5 quiet transformations and 5 magnificent awakenings. Picture a world 450 million years ago, a serene blue marble drifting through space, where no footprint had ever graced a shoreline, no birdsong had ever welcomed the dawn. This was the Ordovician Earth, a water world where all of life's gentle drama unfolded beneath warm, welcoming waves. The seas of this ancient time were unlike any ocean today. They were wonderfully warm, almost tropical from pole to pole, with no ice anywhere to cool their embrace. Sea levels rested nearly 600 feet higher than today, flooding the continents with shallow, sun-kissed waters that sparkled like vast inland lakes. These peaceful seas became nurseries for an abundance of life that would make even our richest coral reefs seem quietly modest by comparison. In these tranquil waters lived the trilobites, arthropods that had been perfecting their elegant forms for nearly 100 million years. Imagine creatures resembling horseshoe crabs, but blessed with compound eyes made of pure, clear calcite crystal, granting them vision more precise than any animal before or since. Some were delicate as coins, gliding gracefully through sand and gentle currents. Others grew as broad as dinner plates, their segmented bodies moving through the water with surprising poise. The largest, like Isotellus rex, stretched 3 feet from head to tail, gentle giants in a world where most creatures measured in quiet inches. But trilobites were just one voice in this underwater symphony. The seafloor bloomed with gardens of creatures that built some of Earth's first peaceful communities. Brachiopods, animals that resembled clams but followed entirely different dreams, carpeted the shallow sea bottoms in vast living tapestries. Their shells, crafted like nature's perfect geometric puzzles, filtered the nutrient-rich water through delicate feeding systems that worked like tiny living sieves. Rising from these soft beds came the first true reefs, built not by corals as we know them, but by their ancient cousins called rugose and tabulate corals. These early reef builders created underwater villages, their cup-shaped homes stacked and intertwined to form towering structures that provided shelter for countless neighbors. Between their branches lived bryozoans, tiny colonial animals that looked like underwater moss, but were actually sophisticated communities, each colony containing thousands of individuals working together in perfect harmony. Swimming through this underwater metropolis were Earth's first vertebrates, gentle jawless fish called agnathons. Picture elongated creatures covered in smooth protective scales with circular mouths designed for careful suction rather than harsh biting. These primitive fish, ancestors to every vertebrate that would ever grace the Earth, drifted through the Ordovician seas like living poetry, their lamprey-like mouths tenderly attaching to other creatures or softly sifting nutrients from the seafloor. The chemistry of these ancient oceans was different too, holding more carbon dioxide and less oxygen than today's waters, creating a greenhouse embrace that kept the planet warm and wonderfully stable. Nutrients circulated freely through the water column like invisible rivers, supporting vast populations of plankton that form the foundation of increasingly intricate food webs. This was life in its marine adolescence, sophisticated enough to build complex communities, yet still cradled entirely by the sea. The continents remained largely bare, painted in gentle shades of red and brown stone, with only the faintest whispers of green, as primitive algae and lichens began their patient colonization of distant shorelines. All the creativity, all the experiments in multicellular living, all the quiet innovations of evolution were happening in the ocean's tender embrace. For countless generations, this warm, stable world seemed eternal. Trilobites wandered across familiar seafloors in peaceful processions. Reef systems grew larger and more intricate with each passing age. The first vertebrates explored new forms with gentle curiosity. It was a golden time of marine abundance, when the oceans hummed with life and the climate smiled down with predictable, nurturing rhythms. But far to the south, a vast continent called Gondwana was beginning its slow, inevitable drift toward the South Pole, carrying within its movement the seeds of profound change. The transformation began so gradually that for millions of years, the trilobites and their neighbors barely noticed. Gondwana, that vast southern continent, continued its patient drift across Earth's surface, following the ancient rhythms of plate tectonics that had been reshaping our world since the very beginning. But as this immense landmass settled over the South Pole like a great blanket, something profound began to shift in the planet's gentle breathing. At first, the changes whispered softly through the global climate. Temperatures dropped by just a degree here, a degree there. The warm, tropical seas that had cradled life for so long began to cool ever so slightly. Snow began falling on southern mountains that had never known winter's touch, and for the first time in millions of years, that snow didn't melt completely when summer returned. As centuries passed into millennia, these small changes gathered momentum like a slow, inexorable tide. Ice sheets began forming on Gondwana's highlands, growing thicker with each passing season. What started as modest mountain glaciers spread outward, covering vast areas of the continent in gleaming white. The ice reflected sunlight back to space, cooling the planet further in a gentle but relentless feedback loop. The effects rippled outward through Earth's interconnected systems. As more and more water became locked away in expanding ice sheets, sea levels began their gradual descent. The warm, shallow seas that had been life's nurturing cradle for millions of years started pulling back from the continental margins like a tide that forgot to return. For the creatures living in these retreating waters, the changes unfolded with dreamlike slowness at first, then with increasing urgency. Vast areas of seafloor that had been home to thriving communities for countless generations found themselves exposed to air for the first time. The extensive reef systems, built over millions of years by patient coral colonies, began to emerge from the water like ancient cities rising from a drying lake. The trilobites, those graceful masters of the Ordovician seas, faced an unprecedented challenge. Species that had adapted to specific depths and temperatures discovered their homes gradually disappearing. Some tried to migrate to deeper waters, but even the deep ocean felt the cooling effects of the global chill. The clear, calcite eyes that had given them such perfect vision in their warm, bright seas now gazed into waters growing darker and colder with each passing generation. The brachiopod gardens that had carpeted the shallow seafloors began to wither as their feeding grounds shrank away. These filter-feeding communities, so perfectly adapted to the gentle currents and rich nutrients of warm, shallow seas, found themselves struggling in the deeper, cooler waters that remained. Many species, unable to adapt quickly enough to such fundamental changes in their world, began their quiet fade into geological memory. But the Ice Age worked its transformation in two distinct pulses, like Earth taking two deep, cold breaths. The first pulse, around 445 million years ago, brought the initial cooling and sea level drop. Many species vanished during this phase, but life showed its remarkable resilience, with survivors adapting to the new, cooler conditions and even beginning to diversify again. Then came the second pulse, roughly 2 million years later, a final, deeper cooling that locked even more water away in ice and dropped sea levels to their lowest point. This second transformation proved too much for many of the species that had survived the first cooling. The remaining shallow water habitats shrank to tiny refuges scattered across the globe. In the end, this gentle but inexorable ice age claimed approximately 85% of all marine species. Entire groups of trilobites that had ruled the seas for millions of years simply faded away, leaving behind only their fossilized shells as testament to their former abundance. Many families of brachiopods, bryozoans, and corals followed them into extinction, their evolutionary experiments coming to a quiet close. Yet even in this time of profound change, life found ways to persist. In the deepest parts of the oceans, where temperatures remained more stable, small populations of survivors waited patiently for the Ice Age to pass. Some trilobite lineages endured in these deep water refuges. Certain brachiopods adapted to cooler conditions. A few coral species discovered ways to thrive in the planet's new, chillier embrace. Most remarkably, this first great transformation cleared the way for life's next bold experiment. As the Ice Age gradually loosened its grip and the seas began to warm again, some of the survivors began exploring an entirely new frontier. The first simple plants, evolved from marine algae, started their tentative colonization of the barren continents, beginning the long, patient process of bringing life to land. The Ordovician-Silurian extinction had ended one chapter of Earth's story, but in doing so, it had opened the book to an entirely new page, one where life would no longer be confined to the sea's gentle embrace, but would spread across the whole world in ways that the trilobites, in their deepest dreams, could never have imagined. Time flowed onward, and 130 million years after the first great transformation, Earth had blossomed into something entirely new. The Devonian period, beginning around 420 million years ago, painted our planet in colors it had never worn before. For the first time in its long history, Earth was no longer a blue marble dotted with barren brown continents. Instead, it had become a world where green was spreading like a gentle dream across landscapes that had waited eons for life's arrival. The seas had recovered magnificently from their icy ordeal, warming once again into tropical abundance. But now, they hosted creatures that would have seemed like fantasies to the peaceful trilobites of the Ordovician. This became known as the Age of Fishes, a time when vertebrates finally claimed their place as the ocean's most innovative inhabitants. Swimming through these ancient waters were the placoderms, armored fish that looked like living submarines designed by nature's most creative engineers. Some, like Dunkleosteus, grew to lengths of 30 feet, their heads encased in bony armor plating that gleamed like polished shields. Instead of teeth, they possessed razor-sharp bone shears that could slice through almost anything the ocean offered. Yet despite their formidable appearance, these giants moved with surprising grace through their aquatic realm, their powerful tails propelling them through the water with fluid elegance. Alongside these armored titans swam the first true sharks, sleek predators whose basic design was so perfect, that it would endure virtually unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Early rays glided across sandy bottoms like living carpets, while primitive bony fish began experimenting with the swimming techniques that would eventually dominate the world's waters. But perhaps the most remarkable creatures of the Devonian seas were those taking their first tentative steps towards something unprecedented: life on land. In shallow coastal waters lived the lobe-finned fish, creatures whose fins contained bones arranged in patterns that would one day support legs. Tiktaalik, often called the fishapod, possessed both gills for breathing underwater and primitive lungs for supplementing its oxygen intake. These remarkable animals could use their muscular fins to prop themselves up in shallow water, occasionally venturing onto mudflats for brief periods, the first vertebrates to experience the strange sensation of gravity's full embrace. Meanwhile, the continents themselves were undergoing their own quiet revolution. The first forests were rising from soil that had never known shade before. These weren't the familiar oak and maple forests of today, but alien woodlands dominated by towering tree ferns and early conifers. Some of these ancient trees, like Archaeopteris, reached heights of 100 feet, creating Earth's first forest canopies and casting shadows across landscapes that had baked under direct sunlight since the world began. Beneath these primitive trees, a carpet of smaller ferns and mosses created the planet's first forest floors, while early arthropods, descendants of sea creatures, scuttled through the undergrowth as the first terrestrial hunters. Millipedes, as long as crocodiles, munched on decaying plant matter, while primitive spiders spun the first webs between fern fronds. The ocean reefs had also returned with renewed splendor, but now they were built by different architects. Stromatoporoids, ancient relatives of modern sponges, constructed massive reef systems that stretched for hundreds of miles. Between their chambers lived new communities of creatures, crinoids that looked like underwater flowers but were actually animals, swaying in the currents like fields of sea lilies. New types of corals that had learned different ways of building their calcium carbonate homes, and trilobites that had survived the great cooling, now diversified into new forms, adapted to this warmer, more complex world. This was Earth learning to live in multiple dimensions. No longer was life confined to a single realm. The boundary between water and land had become a frontier of endless possibility. In the shallows, creatures were discovering the advantages of supplemental breathing. On land, plants were experimenting with height and structure. In the deep oceans, predators were growing larger and more sophisticated than ever before. For nearly 60 million years, this dynamic equilibrium flourished. The climate remained warm and stable, supporting vast reef systems and allowing the first forests to spread across the continents. It seemed as though Earth had found its perfect rhythm, balancing marine abundance with terrestrial innovation in a harmony that could last forever. Yet once again, forces were stirring in the planet's depths that would test life's remarkable adaptability in ways that even the survivors of the Great Ice Age could never have anticipated. The late Devonian extinction unfolded not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow, almost gentle suffocation that stretched across 20 million years, long enough for hundreds of generations of creatures to live entire lifetimes, never knowing their world was gradually slipping away. Beginning around 375 million years ago, this prolonged transformation would test life's resilience in ways entirely different from the swift ice age that had come before. The warning signs whispered through the oceans with deceptive subtlety. Deep in the planet's restless interior, volcanic activity began releasing vast quantities of nutrients into the atmosphere and seas. These nutrients, especially phosphorus and nitrogen, might have seemed like gifts at first, fertilizers that should have made life flourish even more abundantly. Instead, they became the gentle architects of catastrophe. As these nutrients settled into the warm Devonian seas, they triggered massive blooms of algae and bacteria across the ocean's surface. From space, Earth's oceans would have appeared to shimmer with unprecedented productivity, vast carpets of microscopic life, turning the water into living soup. But this abundance carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. When these enormous blooms eventually died, as all living things must, they sank toward the ocean floor in gentle, continuous snowfall. There, countless bacteria went to work, decomposing this organic bounty, but their feast came at a terrible cost. Each bacterial breath consumed precious oxygen from the water, and with such vast amounts of dead organic matter raining down from above, the bacteria's collective breathing began to drain the life-giving oxygen from entire ocean basins. The process unfolded with dreamlike slowness. In the deep waters, oxygen levels began dropping gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Creatures that required high levels of oxygen for their active lifestyles found themselves growing sluggish, their metabolism slowing like clockwork, winding down. The clear, well-oxygenated waters that had supported the great reef systems for millions of years began transforming into something more ominous. Vast zones where the water itself could no longer sustain complex life. These dead zones spread outward from the deep ocean basins like slow-moving shadows, creeping up the continental shelves toward the shallow water communities that had flourished since the world's recovery from the Ice Age. The massive stromatoporoid reefs, built over millions of years by patient sponge-like organisms, began to wither as their builders could no longer extract enough oxygen from the water to maintain their intricate calcium carbonate cities. The armored placoderms, those magnificent titans of the Devonian seas, found themselves particularly vulnerable to the changing conditions. Their active, predatory lifestyles required substantial amounts of oxygen, but the water around them was becoming increasingly unable to provide it. Generation by generation, these great armored fish became rarer, their evolutionary experiments coming to a quiet close in waters that could no longer support their energy needs. Even the trilobites, those ancient survivors who had endured the Ice Age and flourished in the Devonian recovery, faced challenges they had never encountered before. Many species that had adapted to specific oxygen levels found their habitats shrinking as breathable water became scarce. Some of the most elaborate trilobite forms, with their intricate visual systems and complex feeding apparatus, proved too demanding for the ocean's dwindling oxygen budget. But this extinction differed from the Ice Age in a crucial way. It happened in pulses, like a series of gentle waves rather than a single overwhelming tide. Each pulse represented another expansion of oxygen-poor water, another contraction of habitable space. Between these pulses, life had time to adapt, to evolve, to find new strategies for survival in an increasingly challenging world. Some creatures discovered remarkable solutions. Certain fish developed more efficient gills, extracting every possible molecule of oxygen from the thinning water. Others, like the early amphibians evolving from lobe-finned ancestors, found salvation in an entirely new approach, breathing air directly. The ability to supplement gill breathing with primitive lungs became not just an advantage, but a necessity for survival. On land, the growing forests seemed almost oblivious to the ocean's struggles. Plants continued their patient colonization of the continents, their photosynthesis actually adding oxygen to the atmosphere even as the seas lost theirs. The first amphibians began spending more time on land, discovering that the air above the water's surface held all the oxygen their primitive lungs could desire. By the time the late Devonian extinction reached its conclusion around 360 million years ago, approximately 75% of marine species had quietly faded away. The great age of armored fish had ended forever. Many reef-building organisms joined them in extinction, leaving behind only their fossilized skeletons as monuments to communities that had thrived for millions of years. Yet once again, the survivors carried forward the story of life with quiet determination. The fish that remained had learned new efficiencies, new ways of extracting life from water that their ancestors would have found unbreathable. Early amphibians had discovered the revolutionary possibility of air breathing, opening pathways toward evolutionary futures that purely aquatic creatures could never access. The ocean's great experiment in suffocation had ended, but in teaching life new ways to breathe, it had inadvertently prepared the survivors for innovations that would transform the world in ways that even the mighty placoderms, in their armored magnificence, could never have dreamed. After the long recovery from the ocean's suffocation, life entered what may have been its most magnificent chapter. The Permian period, beginning around 299 million years ago, witnessed Earth transformed into something that would have seemed like pure fantasy to the simple creatures of earlier eras. This was life at its most creative, most abundant, most gloriously diverse, a 47-million-year golden age when evolution seemed to be conducting a symphony with every instrument it had ever invented. On land, vast forests stretched to horizons that had once known only barren stone. But these weren't the simple fern woodlands of the Devonian. The Permian forests were architectural marvels, built by seed ferns with fronds that spread like green umbrellas, towering glossopteris trees whose leaves fell in seasonal carpets, and early conifers that pioneered the art of keeping green needles through changing seasons. Some of these ancient trees grew to heights that rivaled modern redwoods, creating cathedral-like spaces beneath their canopies, where dappled sunlight painted patterns on forest floors, rich with the world's first true soil. Wandering through these primeval woodlands were creatures that would have seemed like mythical beasts to earlier ages. The synapsids, distant ancestors of all mammals, had grown into forms both graceful and imposing. Dimetrodon, with its magnificent sail rising from its back like a living sculpture, basked in forest clearings, using its sail to regulate body temperature with an efficiency that made it one of the most successful predators of its time. Edaphosaurus, a plant-eating relative, bore a similar sail but used it to power a gentler lifestyle, browsing on the abundant vegetation with serene persistence. Even more remarkable were creatures like Coryphodon, early synapsids that had begun experimenting with the mammalian innovations that would one day rule the world. These animals showed the first hints of differentiated teeth, some for cutting, others for grinding, and their bodies carried subtle signs of the metabolic advances that would eventually lead to warm-bloodedness and fur. But the synapsids shared their world with other evolutionary experiments equally extraordinary. Early reptiles had discovered the revolutionary amniotic egg, a self-contained life support system that freed reproduction from dependence on water. This innovation allowed reptiles to colonize environments that amphibians could never reach, from arid highlands to the hearts of vast continental interiors. The oceans, too, had recovered magnificently from their earlier ordeal. Permian seas teemed with life forms both familiar and wonderfully strange. Massive reefs built by glass sponges created underwater cities that stretched for hundreds of miles. These weren't simple coral formations, but complex three-dimensional ecosystems where creatures lived in towers of spun glass, their delicate skeletons creating architectural masterpieces that filtered nutrients from the flowing currents. Swimming through these crystal cities were fish that had learned lessons from the Great Suffocation. They moved with efficient grace through water that once again carried abundant oxygen. Sharks had refined their design into forms so perfect they seemed like living equations for predatory success. Early bony fish experimented with new body plans that would eventually populate every watery niche on the planet. Perhaps most remarkable of all were the marine reptiles that had returned to the sea. These creatures, having mastered life on land, chose to explore the ocean's possibilities with tools no purely aquatic animal possessed: the amniotic egg and advanced metabolisms that made them formidable hunters in both warm and cool waters. The climate during this golden age was warm and relatively stable, with no polar ice caps to disrupt the gentle circulation patterns that brought predictable rains to vast continental interiors. Pangaea, the supercontinent, was nearing completion, bringing together land masses from around the globe and allowing creatures to migrate across distances that would have been impossible in earlier times. This connectivity fostered an unprecedented exchange of evolutionary innovations. Successful adaptations spread rapidly across the connected continents, while isolated populations developed unique solutions to local challenges. The result was a planet-wide explosion of biodiversity that made the Permian the most species-rich period in Earth's history. For tens of millions of years, this remarkable world seemed to have found perfect equilibrium. The forests grew larger and more complex with each passing age. Animals evolved into forms of stunning diversity and sophistication. The oceans supported reef systems more extensive than any that had come before or would come after. It was as if evolution had learned all the lessons from previous challenges and applied them to create something approaching biological perfection, a world where every niche was filled, every opportunity explored, every possibility of life expressed in its most magnificent form. But deep beneath this paradise, in the vast wilderness of Siberia, forces were stirring that would test life's resilience more severely than any challenge it had ever faced. At the end of the Permian, 252 million years ago, Earth experienced something so profound that geologists simply call it the Great Dying. The closest life has ever come to complete silence. What began in the remote wilderness of Siberia would spread across the planet like a slow, inexorable tide, transforming paradise into something almost unrecognizable. Yet even this greatest of all extinctions unfolded with a strange, geological patience that allowed life to witness its own transformation across thousands of generations. The catastrophe began deep beneath Siberia, where vast chambers of magma had been accumulating pressure for millions of years. When the release finally came, it wasn't a single volcanic explosion, but something far more systematic and enduring, a geological awakening that would continue for nearly 2 million years. Imagine an area larger than Europe, slowly opening like a wound in the Earth's surface, releasing not just lava, but vast quantities of gases that would reshape the very chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans. The Siberian traps, as geologists now call this ancient volcanic province, poured forth flood basalts that buried an area roughly the size of the continental United States under layers of lava sometimes miles thick. But the lava itself was only the beginning of the transformation. With each eruption came enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other volcanic gases that rose into the atmosphere like invisible rivers, carrying with them the power to alter the planet's entire climate system. At first, the effects might have seemed almost beneficial in distant parts of the world. The carbon dioxide acted like a blanket around the planet, warming temperatures that had begun to cool toward the end of the Permian. But as the eruptions continued year after year, century after century, the warming became something more ominous. Global temperatures rose by as much as 18 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to melt any ice that might have existed and turn even the polar regions into sweltering landscapes. The sulfur compounds created their own devastating effects. High in the atmosphere, they formed tiny droplets of sulfuric acid that fell as gentle but persistent acid rain across vast areas of the planet. This acidic precipitation slowly poisoned the soils where the great Permian forests grew, dissolving nutrients and making the earth itself hostile to plant life. Forest after forest began to thin and fade, their towering seed ferns and glossopteris trees withering under the steady chemical assault from above. As plant communities collapsed, the animals that depended on them faced an impossible situation. The magnificent synapsids, those sail-backed creatures that had ruled the Permian landscape with such success, found their food sources diminishing with each passing season. Herbivores grew thin and weak, and the predators that hunted them began their own decline as prey became increasingly scarce. But perhaps the most devastating effects occurred in the oceans, where the volcanic gases created a cascade of chemical changes that transformed the sea itself into something hostile to most life. The massive amounts of carbon dioxide dissolving into seawater created carbonic acid, dropping the ocean's pH and beginning a process of acidification that made it difficult for creatures with shells or skeletons to build or maintain their calcium carbonate structures. The warming oceans also began to lose their ability to hold dissolved oxygen, creating vast dead zones that spread outward from the deeper basins. The great glass sponge reefs that had taken millions of years to build began to dissolve in the increasingly acidic water, their delicate silicate structures unable to withstand the changing chemistry. As these reef systems collapsed, they took with them entire ecosystems of creatures that had evolved specifically to live within their crystal cities. Even more catastrophically, the warming oceans began to release methane that had been trapped in sediments on the seafloor for millions of years. This methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than carbon dioxide, accelerated the warming in a feedback loop that pushed global temperatures even higher. Some regions of the ocean, may have become so warm and oxygen-poor that they supported only the most primitive forms of life, creating conditions similar to those that had existed billions of years earlier in Earth's history. The extinction unfolded in phases, like a series of gentle but relentless waves. Each pulse of volcanic activity triggered another round of environmental changes, and each change claimed more species that could no longer adapt to their rapidly transforming world. By the time the Great Dying reached its conclusion, an almost unimaginable 96% of marine species had vanished from the fossil record. On land, roughly 70% of vertebrate species disappeared, including most of the magnificent synapsids that had dominated Permian ecosystems. Entire evolutionary lineages that had persisted for hundreds of millions of years simply ended. Many families of trilobites, those ancient survivors who had weathered every previous extinction, finally reached the end of their remarkable journey through deep time. The great reefs that had been among Earth's most spectacular ecosystems were reduced to rubble. Vast forests became barren landscapes where only the hardiest plants could survive. Yet even in this darkest chapter, life demonstrated its most profound characteristic: persistence. Hidden in scattered refugia around the globe, small populations of survivors waited through the worst of the catastrophe. Early archosaurs, reptiles that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs and crocodiles, endured in marginal environments where larger creatures could not compete. Small synapsids persisted in burrows and rocky crevices, their modest size and efficient metabolisms allowing them to survive on meager resources. Some plants discovered ways to thrive in the acidic soils, while certain marine creatures adapted to the low oxygen conditions by developing more efficient ways of extracting dissolved gases from the water. These survivors, scattered and diminished though they were, carried within their genes all the information necessary to rebuild the world. The recovery would be slow, the slowest of any mass extinction, taking nearly 10 million years for ecosystems to regain their complexity. But in clearing away so much of life's accumulated diversity, the Great Dying had also cleared the stage for entirely new evolutionary experiments. Among the survivors were small, agile archosaurs that would, in time, give rise to the most famous inhabitants Earth has ever known. The age of dinosaurs was about to begin. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, Earth entered a period of quiet convalescence that would last for millions of years. The Triassic period, beginning around 251 million years ago, opened on a world so emptied of life that the survivors could spread into ecological spaces that had been unimaginable during the crowded abundance of the Permian. It was like a vast, natural laboratory where evolution could begin its experiments anew, working with a clean slate and endless possibilities. The first few million years of recovery were dominated by what paleontologists call disaster taxa, hardy, opportunistic organisms that could thrive in the harsh conditions left behind by the extinction. These weren't the sophisticated, specialized creatures that had ruled the Permian world, but rather simple, adaptable forms that could make the most of whatever resources remained available. Fungi spread across landscapes, littered with dead plant material, breaking down the organic debris of collapsed ecosystems and preparing the soil for new growth. Gradually, as volcanic activity in Siberia finally began to subside and the atmosphere slowly returned to more breathable compositions, green began creeping back across the continents. The first plants to recolonize the devastated landscapes were hardy pioneers, ferns and seed ferns that could tolerate the still acidic soils, early conifers that required little in the way of complex soil chemistry, and tough cycads that would become characteristic of Triassic plant communities. But the most significant development of this recovery period was happening among the surviving reptiles. The archosaurs, the group that included early crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs, had endured the extinction as small, relatively unspecialized creatures. Now, with so much empty ecological space available, they began one of the most remarkable evolutionary radiations in the history of life. Some archosaurs grew large and became the new apex predators, filling the roles that the great synapsids had once occupied. Others remained small, but developed sophisticated hunting strategies. Still others discovered the possibilities of an entirely new lifestyle. Some early archosaurs began experimenting with bipedal locomotion, standing and running on their hind legs in ways that opened up entirely new possibilities for speed, agility, and energy efficiency. Among these bipedal experimenters were the first true dinosaurs, appearing around 230 million years ago. These early dinosaurs, creatures like Eoraptor and Staurikosaurus, were modest animals, mostly no larger than house cats or small dogs. They possessed a revolutionary combination of features: lightweight bones that made them swift and agile, efficient respiratory systems that allowed for sustained activity, and joints positioned directly beneath their bodies rather than sprawled out to the sides like earlier reptiles. What made these early dinosaurs special wasn't their size or their immediate dominance. For millions of years, they remained relatively minor players in Triassic ecosystems. Instead, their significance lay in their remarkable adaptability and efficiency. They could run faster and farther than most of their contemporaries. They could maintain active lifestyles in a wider range of temperatures and conditions. Most importantly, they possessed what can only be described as evolutionary potential, a basic body plan so sound that it could be modified and adapted to fill almost any ecological niche. The oceans, meanwhile, were undergoing their own quiet renaissance. Marine life had been so thoroughly devastated by the Great Dying that recovery happened in distinct stages, like a choreographed dance of recolonization. Simple organisms appeared first, algae and bacteria that could tolerate the still unusual chemistry of post-extinction seawater. Then came small invertebrates, followed eventually by new types of marine reptiles that would dominate Triassic seas. The most spectacular of these marine recoveries involved entirely new groups of reptiles returning to the ocean. Ichthyosaurs, reptiles that had evolved to look remarkably like dolphins or sharks, developed some of the most sophisticated aquatic adaptations ever seen. Their streamlined bodies, powerful tails, and large eyes made them supremely efficient ocean predators, capable of diving to great depths and pursuing the fastest swimming prey. Continental drift continued its patient work during this recovery period, slowly beginning to pull apart the supercontinent Pangaea. This gradual breakup created new coastlines, new patterns of ocean circulation, and new climatic zones that provided additional opportunities for evolutionary diversification. As the climate warmed and stabilized, seasonal patterns became more predictable, allowing for more complex ecological relationships to develop. The Triassic recovery was remarkable not just for its pace, but for its creativity. Evolution seemed to be exploring possibilities that had never been attempted before. Plants developed new forms of partnership with emerging insect communities. Animals experimented with body plans and lifestyles that would have seemed impossible in earlier eras. The foundations were being laid for ecosystems more complex and diverse than any that had existed before the Great Dying. By the middle of the Triassic, roughly 20 million years after the extinction, Earth had not just recovered, it had been reinvented. The stage was set for new experiments in living that would transform the planet in ways that even the survivors of the Great Dying could never have anticipated. Among the most promising of these experiments were small, bipedal reptiles whose descendants would inherit the Earth in ways that would make the Permian's magnificent synapsids seem like a mere prelude to the main performance. For 50 million years, the Triassic world had been finding its rhythm. Dinosaurs shared the continents with a remarkable diversity of other archosaurs, armored etosaurs that looked like living tanks, massive rauisuchids that ruled as apex predators, and graceful phytosaurs that filled crocodilian niches in ancient rivers. It seemed as though Earth had settled into a new equilibrium, one where many different evolutionary experiments could coexist in creative harmony. But once again, forces stirring deep within the planet were preparing to reshape the world. Around 201 million years ago, as the Triassic period drew to a close, Pangaea began experiencing growing pains that would literally tear the supercontinent apart. What started as subtle geological tremors would eventually become one of the largest volcanic episodes in Earth's history, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, a massive outpouring of lava that would create the foundation for an entirely new ocean. This transformation began slowly, almost gently, as stress fractures appeared, along what would eventually become the boundaries between future continents. For thousands of years, these cracks deepened and widened with patient persistence. Then, like a dam finally giving way to accumulated pressure, the Earth's crust began to split along a line that would eventually separate North America from Africa and South America from Europe. The volcanic activity that accompanied this continental breakup was different from the catastrophic Siberian eruptions that had ended the Permian. Instead of concentrated devastation in a single region, the Central Atlantic volcanism spread along thousands of miles of rifting crust, creating a more distributed but equally profound transformation of the global environment. Lava flows covered vast areas of what would become the eastern seaboard of North America, Western Africa, and parts of South America, while volcanic gases once again began altering the composition of Earth's atmosphere. But this fourth extinction unfolded more gradually than its predecessors, taking place over roughly 500,000 years, rather than occurring as a sudden catastrophe. This slower pace allowed for something unprecedented, a kind of evolutionary competition between different groups of archosaurs, each adapting to the changing conditions in their own way. The climate began warming as volcanic carbon dioxide accumulated in the atmosphere. Ocean chemistry started shifting as massive amounts of volcanic material altered the acidity and nutrient content of seawater. On land, changing precipitation patterns and rising temperatures created new stresses for plant and animal communities that had adapted to the relatively stable conditions of the Middle and Late Triassic. Many of the Triassic's most distinctive creatures found themselves poorly equipped for these changing conditions. The heavily armored itosaurs, which had been so successful in stable Triassic environments, discovered that their elaborate protective plating made them less efficient in a warming world where mobility and metabolic flexibility became increasingly important. The massive Rauisuchids, despite their success as predators, required large territories and abundant prey, resources that became scarcer as ecosystems reorganized around new climatic conditions. The phytosaurs, those crocodile-like rulers of Triassic waterways, faced particular challenges as changing precipitation patterns altered river systems and wetland habitats. Many of the specialized semi-aquatic lifestyles that had flourished during the stable Middle Triassic became difficult to maintain as water sources became less predictable. But while these established groups struggled with the changing conditions, the modest dinosaurs that had remained relatively minor players throughout most of the Triassic began to reveal their hidden advantages. Their efficient respiratory systems, inherited from their archosaur ancestry, allowed them to maintain active lifestyles even as atmospheric conditions changed. Their upright posture and lightweight construction made them more energy efficient than their sprawling competitors, giving them crucial advantages when resources became scarce. Perhaps most importantly, dinosaurs had already begun diversifying into different ecological roles during the Triassic. Some had become swift, agile predators. Others had evolved into efficient herbivores. A few had even begun experimenting with larger body sizes. This diversity meant that as environmental conditions shifted, there were always some dinosaur lineages positioned to take advantage of new opportunities. The marine realm experienced its own set of changes during this period. Ocean circulation patterns shifted as the opening Atlantic began to alter global water flow. New volcanic islands and underwater ridges created different habitats and migration routes. While these changes weren't as devastating to marine life as previous extinctions had been, they still led to significant reorganizations of ocean ecosystems. By the time the Triassic-Jurassic extinction reached its conclusion, approximately 76% of species had faded away. Not quite as severe as previous mass extinctions, but sufficient to fundamentally reorganize terrestrial ecosystems. Most of the distinctive Triassic archosaurs had disappeared, along with many plant species and marine organisms that had defined late Triassic communities. The survivors inherited a world that was warmer, more humid, and more fragmented than the Triassic world had been. Pangaea's breakup was creating new geographic barriers and new opportunities for isolated evolution. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were higher than they had been for millions of years, supporting lush plant growth in many regions. Into this transformed world stepped the dinosaurs, no longer minor players, but increasingly dominant members of terrestrial ecosystems. The stage was set for their remarkable diversification into the forms that would rule the Earth for the next 135 million years. a reign longer than any group of animals had ever achieved, and longer than any would achieve again. The Jurassic period, beginning around 201 million years ago, opened like a gentle renaissance for life on Earth. With the great continental breakup well underway, the world was becoming a warmer, more humid place, where vast inland seas sparkled between newly separated landmasses. The harsh volcanic winter of the Triassic-Jurassic extinction had passed, leaving behind a planet perfectly suited for one of evolution's most spectacular experiments, the age when dinosaurs would truly inherit the Earth. This was a world without polar ice, where even the Arctic regions basked in subtropical warmth. Shallow seas flooded low-lying areas of the continents, creating countless islands and peninsulas that provided isolated laboratories for evolutionary innovation. The atmosphere held more carbon dioxide than today, creating a gentle greenhouse effect that supported lush vegetation from pole to pole. In this benevolent climate, dinosaurs began their remarkable transformation from modest Triassic survivors into the most diverse group of large land animals the world had ever seen. The most spectacular of these developments occurred among the sauropods, the long-necked giants that would become symbols of the dinosaur age. Early Jurassic forms like Volcanodon were already impressive, but as the period progressed, these creatures achieved sizes that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. Brachiosaurus, with its giraffe-like proportions, could reach leaves 40 feet above the ground, accessing food sources that no land animal before or since has been able to exploit. Diplodocus stretched to lengths of nearly 90 feet, its whip-like tail serving as both counterbalance and defensive weapon. These giants were made possible by evolutionary innovations that solved the fundamental problems of being enormous. Their bones were hollowed by air sacs, similar to those found in modern birds, making their skeletons surprisingly light for their size. Their long necks contained a complex system of ligaments and tendons that worked like natural suspension cables, supporting massive heads without requiring impossibly large neck muscles. Most remarkably, they seem to have possessed sophisticated temperature regulation systems that allowed them to maintain stable body temperatures despite their enormous bulk. But the Jurassic wasn't only about giants. In the shadows of the sauropods, other dinosaur lineages were exploring equally remarkable evolutionary pathways. The first bird-like dinosaurs appeared during this period, though they remained firmly earthbound. Archaeopteryx, preserved in the fine limestone of ancient Bavarian lagoons, showed the earliest evidence of feathers, not yet used for flight, but possibly for display, insulation, or the beginnings of gliding between trees. Predatory dinosaurs, too, were reaching new heights of sophistication. Allosaurus stalked the late Jurassic landscapes with a perfect balance of size, speed, and intelligence, possessing serrated teeth that could slice through even the tough hide of sauropods. Smaller predators like Compsognathus demonstrated that dinosaurs could be successful at any scale, their bird-like agility allowing them to exploit ecological niches that larger predators couldn't access. The marine realm had also recovered magnificently from previous extinctions, though it was ruled not by dinosaurs but by other reptile lineages that had returned to the sea. Plesiosaurs patrolled Jurassic oceans with elegant paddle-powered swimming, some growing to lengths that rivaled the largest dinosaurs on land. Ichthyosaurs reached their peak during this period, with forms like Ophthalmosaurus developing echolocation abilities and diving capabilities that wouldn't be matched until the evolution of modern sperm whales. Plant life during the Jurassic created landscapes that would seem both familiar and alien to modern eyes. Vast forests of conifers, tree ferns, and cycads created cathedral-like spaces where dinosaurs moved in dappled sunlight. These plants had formed intricate relationships with their dinosaurian neighbors. Some had evolved defensive spines and toxic compounds to deter browsing, while others seemed to have co-evolved with specific dinosaur species in mutually beneficial relationships. The breakup of Pangaea was creating new opportunities for isolated evolution. Dinosaur populations separated by expanding ocean basins began developing along different evolutionary paths, leading to a burst of speciation that filled the world with an unprecedented diversity of forms. Each continent was becoming a unique evolutionary laboratory where dinosaurs could experiment with new body plans and lifestyles. Perhaps most remarkably, the Jurassic established patterns of ecosystem complexity that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. Food webs included multiple levels of herbivores, from small, agile ornithopods to massive sauropods, each exploiting different plant resources and feeding strategies. Predators ranged from tiny insectivores to enormous carnivores capable of hunting the largest herbivores. Scavengers, omnivores, and specialized feeders filled countless ecological niches with elegant precision. For 56 million years, this Jurassic paradise continued its patient elaboration. Dinosaurs grew larger, more diverse, and more sophisticated with each passing geological age. They established themselves not as temporary rulers of a recovering world, but as permanent fixtures in Earth's biological architecture, so successful that their dominance seemed as eternal as the mountains themselves. Yet even as dinosaurs reached these peaks of success and diversity, the planet was preparing for changes that would once again test life's remarkable adaptability in ways that the peaceful Jurassic world could never have anticipated. The Cretaceous period, beginning around 145 million years ago, witnessed life reaching what may have been its most magnificent crescendo. This was Earth's final act in the age of dinosaurs, a 79-million-year symphony where every evolutionary theme developed since the first trilobites crawled across Ordovician seafloors was played with masterful sophistication. It was as if the planet had been practicing for 500 million years just to create this moment of biological perfection. The world of the Cretaceous was a gardener's dream, made manifest on a planetary scale. A quiet revolution had been unfolding among the plants, the rise of flowering species that would transform terrestrial landscapes more completely than any single innovation since photosynthesis itself. These angiosperms, as botanists call them, didn't simply add new colors to existing ecosystems. They rewrote the very rules of how life on land could operate. Where Jurassic landscapes had been dominated by the subtle greens and browns of conifers and ferns, Cretaceous forests blazed with the brilliant colors of flowers, fruits, and broad leaves that changed with the seasons. Magnolias bloomed in ancient woodlands, their creamy petals attracting the first sophisticated pollinators. Early roses, water lilies, and relatives of modern oaks created environments that would seem almost familiar to modern eyes, yet were populated by creatures from humanity's deepest dreams. This floral revolution supported an explosion of dinosaur diversity that surpassed even the remarkable achievements of the Jurassic. The herbivorous dinosaurs had become living masterpieces of engineering and artistry. Triceratops, with its magnificent three-horned frill, represented the culmination of ceratopsian evolution, creatures that had learned to turn defense into spectacular display, their elaborate facial ornaments serving as both shields and social signals. The hadrosaurs, or duck-billed dinosaurs, had discovered the secret of processing tough plant material with unprecedented efficiency. Their complex dental batteries could grind through the fibrous stems and leaves of flowering plants, while their hollow crests created resonating chambers that filled Cretaceous forests with haunting songs, some low and rumbling like distant thunder, others high and melodious as flute music drifting through ancient groves. Ankylosaurs had perfected the art of living fortification, their bodies encased in bony armor so complete that they resembled walking tanks designed by nature's most patient sculptor. Some, like Ankylosaurus itself, carried massive clubs at the end of their tails, weapons capable of shattering the leg bones of even the largest predators with a single perfectly timed swing. Among the predators, evolution had crafted its most imposing masterpiece in Tyrannosaurus rex. Standing 20 feet tall and stretching 40 feet from nose to tail, T-Rex possessed jaws that could exert crushing forces of over 12,000 pounds per square inch, enough to bite through a car. Yet for all its fearsome reputation, T-Rex moved through its world with surprising grace, its massive body balanced perfectly over powerful legs that could propel it at speeds that would challenge a galloping horse. But the Cretaceous wasn't only about giants. Smaller predators like Velociraptor had perfected the art of pack hunting, their sickle-shaped claws and remarkable intelligence making them formidable opponents despite their modest size. These creatures possessed enlarged brains and forward-facing eyes that gave them depth perception, innovations that hinted at cognitive abilities that wouldn't seem out of place among modern mammals. The seas of the Cretaceous hosted their own spectacular communities. Mosasaurs, marine lizards that had returned to the ocean, grew to lengths of 50 feet or more, their powerful flippers and streamlined bodies making them supremely effective ocean predators. They shared their aquatic realm with massive marine crocodiles, long-necked plesiosaurs, and sharks that had refined their design to near perfection. Perhaps most remarkably, the Cretaceous saw the continuing evolution of feathered dinosaurs and the first true birds. While Archaeopteryx had shown the potential for flight in the Jurassic, Cretaceous birds like Iberomysornis demonstrated powered, sustained flight that opened up entirely new three-dimensional habitats. These early birds coexisted with their dinosaur cousins in complex forest ecosystems, where ground-dwelling giants and tree-hopping flyers shared resources with remarkable efficiency. The climate during much of the Cretaceous was wonderfully stable and warm, with sea levels higher than they had ever been in Earth's history. This created vast inland seas that supported diverse marine ecosystems while moderating continental climates. The Atlantic Ocean was still relatively narrow, but growing wider each year as continental drift continued its patient work of reshaping the planet's geography. For millions of years, this elaborate biological symphony played on, with seemingly endless variations and improvisations. Dinosaur species arose, flourished, and gave way to new forms in an ongoing dance of evolutionary creativity. Ecosystems became more complex and interconnected with each passing age, creating webs of relationships that spanned from the tiniest flowering plants to the mightiest sauropods. It seemed as though this golden age could continue indefinitely, with life growing ever more sophisticated and beautiful under the gentle guidance of natural selection. The dinosaurs had proven themselves masters of adaptation, having survived multiple extinction events and flourished through changing climates and shifting continents for over 165 million years. But in the final chapters of the Cretaceous, subtle changes were beginning to accumulate. Shifts in sea level, gradual cooling, and increased volcanic activity that would set the stage for the most famous catastrophe in Earth's history. The age of dinosaurs was approaching its dramatic conclusion, though the magnificent creatures that ruled this final golden age could never have imagined the cosmic surprise that awaited them. On a day like any other, 66 million years ago, the sun rose over a world that had known peace for millions of years. Triceratops herds grazed in flowering meadows, their three-horned heads moving rhythmically as they cropped the abundant vegetation. In nearby forests, massive T-Rex moved through dappled sunlight with the confident grace of creatures that had never known a serious challenge to their dominance. Overhead, early birds called to each other from branches heavy with primitive flowers, while small mammals scurried through the underbrush, living their modest lives in the shadows of giants. None of these creatures could have imagined that high above them, invisible against the blue sky, a mountain-sized piece of rock and metal was falling toward Earth at a speed that would have carried it from New York to Los Angeles in less than 4 minutes. This asteroid, roughly 6 miles across, had been wandering through space for billions of years, following the gravitational rhythms of the solar system in patient silence. Now, by cosmic chance, its path intersected with our planet's orbit at precisely the moment when Earth was home to the most spectacular community of large land animals it had ever hosted. The impact, when it came, transformed a single instant into a boundary between worlds. The asteroid struck the shallow tropical sea off what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, penetrating the water and seafloor before burying itself deep in the Earth's crust. The energy released in that moment was almost beyond comprehension. Imagine every earthquake, volcanic eruption, and severe storm that has occurred in recorded human history, then multiply that force by thousands. The immediate effects rippled outward like the universe's most violent symphony. A fireball brighter than the sun expanded from the impact site, vaporizing everything within hundreds of miles in mere seconds. The force of the collision sent shockwaves through the solid Earth itself, creating earthquakes that would have registered beyond any scale we use today. Massive chunks of molten rock, some larger than mountains, were hurled high into the atmosphere and began falling back to Earth across the entire planet like a gentle rain of fire. As these glowing fragments descended through the atmosphere, they heated the air until the very sky began to glow. Forests across the globe burst into flame, not from direct impact, but simply from the radiant heat of the superheated atmosphere. The dinosaurs that had ruled terrestrial ecosystems for over 160 million years found their world literally igniting around them. But the fires were only the beginning of the transformation. The impact had thrown an enormous amount of dust, ash, and vaporized rock high into the atmosphere, creating a shroud that began to dim the sun's light. At first, the sky probably glowed with an eerie twilight as countless particles scattered and reflected the sunlight. Then, as more debris settled into the upper atmosphere, a deeper dimming began that would persist for months. Without adequate sunlight, the intricate web of photosynthesis that supported all terrestrial ecosystems began to unravel. Plants, unable to manufacture food through their solar-powered chemistry, began to weaken and die. The magnificent flowering forests that had supported such diverse dinosaur communities started to wither, their leaves falling like gentle snow across landscapes, now lit only by the dim glow of fires and the faint light filtering through the dusty atmosphere. For the herbivorous dinosaurs, this presented an impossible challenge. The massive sauropods, duck-billed hadrosaurs, and armored ankylosaurs required enormous quantities of plant food to fuel their great bodies. As vegetation became scarce, these gentle giants faced starvation in a world that could no longer support their magnificent scale. The very size that had been their greatest advantage for millions of years became the weight that pulled them toward extinction. The carnivorous dinosaurs faced their own version of the same crisis. As the herbivores weakened and died, the predators found themselves in a world with dwindling prey. T-Rex, the ultimate predator, discovered that being perfectly adapted to hunt large, healthy herbivores was less useful when such prey no longer existed. The complex food webs that had supported dinosaur ecosystems for so many millions of years collapsed like dominoes falling in slow motion. Marine ecosystems suffered their own version of this catastrophe. The impact had created massive tsunamis that scoured coastlines and swept far inland, destroying coastal habitats and mixing ocean waters in chaotic ways. The same debris that darkened skies also settled into the oceans, reducing the sunlight available to marine plants and disrupting the foundation of oceanic food webs. Massive marine reptiles like mosasaurs and long-necked plesiosaurs found their world transformed into something they could no longer navigate successfully. Yet even in this darkest chapter of Earth's story, the seeds of recovery were being quietly planted. Small mammals, many no larger than modern mice or rats, possessed crucial advantages that the dinosaurs lacked. Their modest size meant they needed far less food to survive. Many lived in burrows that provided shelter from the burning skies and the subsequent cold. Their warm-blooded metabolisms, though expensive to maintain, allowed them to remain active even as temperatures fluctuated wildly. Some dinosaurs did survive this cosmic catastrophe, though they were the smallest, most bird-like members of their group. These feathered dinosaurs, with their efficient metabolisms and ability to fly to new food sources, carried the dinosaur lineage forward into the post-impact world. Today we know them simply as birds, living dinosaurs that never forgot how to soar above the challenges that grounded their giant relatives. The impact winter gradually lifted as debris settled from the atmosphere and normal weather patterns slowly reasserted themselves. When clear skies finally returned to Earth, they revealed a world transformed beyond recognition, emptied of the magnificent giants that had defined terrestrial life for so long, but filled with new possibilities for the humble survivors who had endured in patient silence. The age of dinosaurs had ended, but the age of mammals was about to begin. In the aftermath of the Great Impact, Earth entered what paleontologists call the Paleocene, the dawn of a new age that would be defined not by the thunderous footsteps of giants, but by the quiet rustling of small, warm bodies emerging from their hiding places into a world suddenly full of possibilities. For the first time in over 160 million years, large ecological niches stood empty, waiting like vacant theaters for new performers to take the stage. The early mammals that crept cautiously from their burrows and tree hollows inherited a landscape that would have seemed almost alien to their ancestors. The towering forests of flowering trees remained, but they were now eerily quiet, no longer shaking under the weight of massive sauropods or echoing with the territorial calls of great predators. Instead, these woodlands offered unprecedented opportunities for creatures that had spent millions of years living in the margins of a dinosaur-dominated world. Within just a few million years, a mere blink in geological time, mammals began one of the most remarkable evolutionary radiations in the history of life. Small, shrew-like creatures, gave rise to lineages that would explore every conceivable way of being a large land animal. Some remained small and agile, perfecting the art of quick movement and high metabolisms. Others began the patient journey toward larger sizes, discovering that in a world without dinosaurs, being big once again offered significant advantages. The first large mammals appeared with surprising speed. Creatures like Barolambda grew to the size of small bears, using their powerful claws to dig for roots and their crushing teeth to process tough plant material in ways that recalled the ecological roles once filled by smaller dinosaurs. Other early mammals explored the possibilities of carnivory, developing sharp teeth and powerful jaws that allowed them to hunt prey larger than the insects and small vertebrates their ancestors had pursued. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this mammalian radiation was its creativity. Unlike the dinosaurs, which had achieved their diversity within a relatively consistent body plan, mammals began experimenting with radically different approaches to life. Some, like the early primates, took to the trees and developed the grasping hands and keen eyesight that would eventually lead to our own lineage. Others returned to the water, beginning the evolutionary journey that would produce whales, seals, and other marine mammals. The climate of the early Cenozoic was warm and humid, supporting lush forests that extended almost to the poles. Without the massive, herbivorous dinosaurs to consume and trample vegetation, plant communities grew thick and diverse, creating complex three-dimensional habitats that mammals could exploit in ways that dinosaurs, despite their remarkable adaptations, had never fully explored. Grasslands began to spread across many continents as the climate gradually cooled and dried. These new ecosystems created opportunities for entirely new lifestyles. Grazing mammals that could process the tough grasses with specialized digestive systems, and swift predators adapted to hunt across open plains. The evolution of horses, cattle, and their relatives transformed vast areas of the planet into landscapes that would remain largely unchanged until the rise of human agriculture. Meanwhile, the survivors of the dinosaur lineage, the birds, underwent their own remarkable diversification. Freed from competition with their larger dinosaur relatives, birds rapidly evolved into new ecological roles. Some, like the terror birds of South America, grew to enormous sizes and became apex predators. Others remained small, but diversified into thousands of forms, exploiting every conceivable aerial niche and many terrestrial ones as well. The oceans, too, were recovering and transforming. Marine mammals began their remarkable return to the sea, while new groups of fish and invertebrates filled the roles once occupied by marine reptiles. Coral reefs slowly recovered from the impact devastation, eventually growing into ecosystems even more diverse than those of the Cretaceous. As millions of years passed, the early experimental phase of mammalian evolution gave way to increasingly sophisticated forms. Social behaviors evolved that allowed mammals to coordinate their activities in ways that rivaled the most advanced dinosaur communities. Complex communication systems developed, along with increasingly large brains capable of learning, problem-solving, and even cultural transmission of information. By 30 million years after the Great Impact, Earth had been completely transformed. The age of mammals was in full swing, with ecosystems as complex and beautiful as any in the planet's history. Yet this new world retained echoes of the dinosaur age, in the songs of birds, in the warm-blooded metabolism that mammals and dinosaurs had independently evolved, and in the continuing creativity of evolution, as it explored new possibilities for life on Earth. The great breathing cycle of extinction and recovery had turned once again, creating not just new species, but entirely new ways of being alive. After witnessing Earth's 5 great transformations, patterns begin to emerge from the apparent chaos of extinction and recovery, gentle rhythms that reveal the deeper logic of how life persists through even the most challenging circumstances. These patterns offer profound insights into the qualities that separate survivors from the departed, and they paint a picture of resilience that is both humbling and inspiring. Size, it turns out, has been one of the most consistent predictors of survival across all 5 mass extinctions. Time and again, the largest, most magnificent creatures have proven to be the most vulnerable when Earth's systems shift dramatically. The enormous trilobites of the Ordovician, the armored giants of the Devonian seas, the spectacular synapsids of the Permian, and the mighty dinosaurs of the Cretaceous all discovered that their impressive proportions became liabilities when resources grew scarce and environments changed rapidly. Small creatures, by contrast, have shown remarkable persistence through catastrophic times. They require less food, reproduce more quickly, and can shelter in refugia too modest to support larger organisms. The mammals that inherited the post-dinosaur world were primarily mouse-sized creatures that could survive on seeds, insects, and scraps. The birds that represent living dinosaurs today descended from small, agile forms rather than the towering giants that dominated Mesozoic landscapes. Dietary flexibility has proven equally crucial for navigating extinction events. Creatures with specialized feeding requirements, those that depended on specific plants, particular prey species, or unique environmental conditions, often found themselves trapped when their narrow niches disappeared. The survivors, more often than not, were the generalists, creatures comfortable eating a variety of foods, adapting to different temperatures, and making homes in diverse habitats. Geographic distribution has also played a vital role in determining survival. Species confined to small ranges or specific regions frequently vanished entirely when their local environments changed. Meanwhile, widespread species with populations scattered across different continents and climate zones almost always had some populations positioned to weather whatever catastrophe unfolded. This geographic insurance policy has proven invaluable across all 5 extinction events. Perhaps most intriguingly, metabolic efficiency has emerged as a hidden key to survival. Warm-blooded creatures, despite the high energy costs of maintaining constant body temperature, have shown remarkable resilience through times of environmental stress. Their ability to remain active in cool conditions, regulate their body chemistry precisely, and maintain complex behaviors even when external conditions fluctuate, has provided crucial advantages during recovery periods. The role of refugia, those hidden sanctuaries where life persists while the world transforms around them, cannot be overstated. Deep ocean basins during ice ages, high-altitude locations during warming periods, cave systems during atmospheric poisoning, and underground burrows during impact winters have all served as arcs carrying life through its darkest moments. The survivors emerging from these refugia have consistently become the architects of Earth's next evolutionary chapter. Recovery patterns too follow recognizable rhythms. Life doesn't simply bounce back after mass extinctions. It often returns with unprecedented creativity. The empty ecological spaces left by extinct species become laboratories for evolutionary innovation. The mammals that diversified after the dinosaur extinction explored body plans and lifestyles that had never been attempted before. Similarly, the archosaurs that survived the Great Dying gave rise to dinosaurs that transformed terrestrial ecosystems in ways their Permian ancestors could never have imagined. These recoveries also reveal the profound interconnectedness of Earth's living systems. The survival of flowering plants helped determine which herbivorous mammals would succeed in post-dinosaur ecosystems. The persistence of marine plankton provided the foundation for recovering ocean food webs. The continuity of insect communities ensured that terrestrial ecosystems retained their essential pollinators and decomposers. Time itself emerges as perhaps the most surprising element in these patterns. Most mass extinctions, even the apparently sudden ones, actually unfold over thousands or tens of thousands of years. Time spans that allow for adaptation, migration, and evolutionary responses. The creatures that survive are often those that can track changing conditions across landscapes and adapt their behaviors, physiology, or reproductive strategies to match new realities. Most remarkably, each extinction event has ultimately increased rather than decreased the overall complexity of life on Earth. While many species vanish during each crisis, the survivors typically diversify into more ecological roles than existed before. The 5 mass extinctions have served not as setbacks for life, but as creative opportunities, moments when evolution could experiment with entirely new approaches to the challenge of living successfully on a dynamic planet. These patterns remind us that extinction and survival are not random processes, but reflect deeper principles about adaptation, resilience, and the remarkable creativity of life itself when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. Today, scientists recognize that Earth is experiencing its 6th mass extinction, though this one differs profoundly from the 5 great transformations that came before. Where previous extinctions were driven by volcanic eruptions, ice ages, or cosmic impacts, this current chapter is unfolding through the actions of a single species. ourselves, in ways both rapid and remarkably widespread. The pace of species loss today matches or exceeds the rates seen during the most severe extinction events in Earth's history. Yet unlike the asteroid that ended the age of dinosaurs or the volcanic catastrophe that triggered the Great Dying, human-driven changes are happening across multiple fronts simultaneously. Habitat destruction fragments, ancient ecosystems, climate change shifts, temperature and precipitation patterns faster than many species can adapt, and the introduction of non-native species disrupts evolutionary relationships that took millions of years to develop. What makes this extinction unique is not just its cause, but its selectivity. Previous mass extinctions typically claimed victims based on size, habitat requirements, or metabolic needs, following the patterns we've seen repeated across deep time. The current extinction, however, is eliminating species based on their relationship to human activities, creating entirely new selection pressures that favor organisms capable of thriving in human-modified environments. Yet the same patterns of resilience that guided life through previous catastrophes continue to operate today. Small, adaptable species with flexible diets and wide geographic ranges are proving more resistant to human-caused changes. Urban environments, despite their challenges, have become refugia for surprisingly diverse communities of plants and animals that have learned to navigate this newest chapter in Earth's long story. Perhaps most importantly, this sixth extinction is the first to be recognized while it's happening by the species causing it. Unlike the unconscious volcanic forces or cosmic accidents that drove previous mass extinctions, humans possess both the awareness to understand what's occurring and the potential to influence its outcome, a responsibility and opportunity unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. As we reach the end of this long journey through deep time, one truth emerges above all others. Earth's capacity for renewal is perhaps the most remarkable force in the natural world. 5 times our planet has approached the edge of biological silence, and 5 times it has returned with life forms more diverse, more sophisticated, and more beautiful than what came before. Each extinction taught life new lessons about persistence. The ice age that claimed the trilobites opened pathways for the first forests to colonize the continents. The ocean suffocation that ended the age of armored fish prepared the way for amphibians to discover the possibilities of breathing air. The Great Dying, despite claiming 96% of marine species, cleared the stage for dinosaurs to begin their magnificent 165 million-year reign. The volcanic breakup that ended the Triassic allowed dinosaurs to diversify into forms that still capture our imagination today. And the asteroid that ended the age of giants created space for mammals, and eventually us, to explore entirely new ways of being conscious, creative participants in Earth's ongoing story. Through each transformation, the same gentle patterns of resilience have guided recovery. Small survivors emerging from hidden refugia, evolutionary creativity filling empty ecological spaces, and life's irrepressible tendency to become more complex and interconnected over time. These patterns remind us that extinction events, however catastrophic they may seem in the moment, are also opportunities. Moments when Earth reinvents itself and discovers new possibilities for beauty and wonder. The story of Earth's 5 great dyings is ultimately a story about hope. It reveals a planet with an almost infinite capacity for renewal, guided by life's most fundamental characteristic, the quiet determination to persist, adapt, and flourish, even under the most challenging circumstances. Tonight, as you rest, remember that you are part of this continuing story. The breath you draw connects you to the first photosynthetic bacteria that oxygenated ancient seas. The warmth of your body echoes the metabolic innovations of early mammals. Your capacity for wonder links you to countless generations of survivors who looked up at the same stars and found reasons to continue their patient journey through time. Earth continues its gentle breathing, and life continues its eternal experiment in becoming ever more magnificently alive. If you've enjoyed this video, then like it and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on new uploads. Sweet dreams, my friends.